Well, happy Halloween, everyone. Today we'll start with a closer look at Frankenstorm, the superstorm named Sandy. Pictures of destruction and devastation continue to come in as millions of Americans try to pick up the pieces from what is now being referred to as the worst storm in at least 100 years. We want to talk now about the effects of the storm and dissect not so much the weather patterns that led to it, but the patterns in lifestyle that have led to the extreme damage and wreckage. To discuss, let's go now to Jacob Remus, assistant professor at SUNY Empire State College. Jacob, first of all, how's it going there in New York? What have you seen over the last few days?
Well, one of the things about perhaps all disasters, but especially this one, is that they're very localized. So I'm very lucky in the part of Brooklyn where I am. I am basically unaffected. But just a few miles away, people are still dealing with flooding. People are still dealing with massive power outages, as you know. People are dealing, part of the tallness of New York, is that people are still dealing with water outages because in order to get water up to tall buildings, you need power. So people are definitely still cleaning up, still dealing with things in a sort of basic way here.
Absolutely. And of course, this has brought forth quite a few discussions. After seeing the wrath of Superstorm Sandy, as a disaster historian, talk to me about some of the lessons that you've drawn from this.
Yeah, so I think that we see some of the same patterns that we see in other disasters. We see that different people are affected in different ways. So, for instance, in the evacuation zone in New York City, the evacuation zone A, as it was called, people were more than twice as likely in evacuation zone A to be residents of public housing than they were in the city at large. So we already know that in New York City, the people who are already most vulnerable, who are already poorest, were the people who are being affected the most.
Well, that's what we see in New York City, but what about what we've seen in some of these other areas, the Jersey Shore, some of these beach communities that really have gotten hurt here?
Yeah, so one of the things about disasters is that we build in places where it might be dangerous, and we know this, and that's true of lots of things, right? We do lots of things that are dangerous, and I'm not at all saying that people shouldn't be living on the Jersey Shore. I'm saying that part of living in the world is having risk, and part of the question is how do we manage risk? And one of the ways we manage risk is by having the government and having government programs, things like flood insurance, things like FEMA, and other aspects of the government that protect us when things go wrong.
So connect some dots for me, because taking a look at New York City, as you say, a lot of the people already the most vulnerable living in public housing. These are the people affected quite a bit. Then we have these people at these nice beach homes, many of these homes, these nice cars destroyed. And of course, you can't see a storm like Sandy and not remember what happened during Katrina. So connect the dots here and sort of bring forth a bigger picture.
Sure. So the first dot to connect is to climate, I think. There's no particular way to know what storm is created by climate change. There have been hurricanes for a long time. Hurricanes fluctuate in intensity and in numbers. So we can't say precisely this is a climate change disaster. But what we do know is that as oceans rise because of climate change, storm surges will get worse. We know that it makes us more vulnerable to the storms that do happen. And there's some evidence that the intensity of storms will increase. The number of storms that are particularly bad will increase. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as with Katrina, we have to look at the way we build our infrastructure, right? At the end of Katrina, the streets of New Orleans were dry. What happened was the infrastructure that we built, the levees, collapsed. In New York, part of the question is, what is our infrastructure here? Does our subway system allow for us, which we depend on to a tremendous amount in the city, is it good enough for the climate we live in? And I think what this week is showing us is the answer is no. In places like Long Island, where 90% of people don't have power, or the Jersey Shore, the question is, does our electrical grid have that ability to serve us in disaster? And I think the answer is pretty clearly no.
And it's really tough here because when you take a look, for example, of the New York subway, this is something I was shocked to learn. 7 million people a day use this. People, coming in and out of different parts of New York, of Jersey, and of course within, the island of Manhattan, of course. But 105, 108 years is a pretty good run to go without having any major disaster. Of course, now that we have this, it certainly is an appropriate time to ask these questions. Is it good enough? So, I mean, I guess what's the, how do we measure this here?
Disasters are disasters for a reason. One of the things that that's why we call them that. One of the things that makes a disaster is that the things that we rely on every day don't work. And we're gonna have disasters, and part of the question is, how do we recover from disasters? People like me call this resilience. How do we build societies and communities that are particularly resilient when a disaster strikes? So one of the things to look at with the New York City subway is who is most affected by this inability to get around. I'm not at work. You can see I'm at home, but that doesn't matter to me so much. I'm a college professor. I'm not paid by the hour. If I'm not at work, it doesn't matter. The person who is selling me food at the bodega, the person who is working at the hotel or the supermarket in low-wage contingent work, they're not so lucky. Those people are extremely dependent on working public transportation. And so it's one of the ways that we can see that the disaster affects different people differently, and that we need to take that into account in our measurements of what is going on in this disaster.
So I guess what's the proposed solution then? Clearly, you're pointing out a problem. I think it's a viable problem. It's an important one to talk about. But what could be done differently?
That's a really good question. I'm not an engineer, but I have seen discussions today of past plans to build essentially sort of sea gates to protect New York Harbor from storm surges. There are various other engineering or technological means by which to protect the city of New York's infrastructure, or the infrastructure, the power infrastructure of Long Island or New Jersey. For instance, burying the lines of the electricity lines. That's why I have power, because my lines are buried. That's something that traditionally power companies have been really reluctant to do because it's super expensive. But it's a choice. It's a choice we make or don't make.
Just final question for you, Jacob. I want to talk about something that a whole lot of people aren't aware of, and that is that during this storm, the path of Superstorm Sandy, there were 26 nuclear plants. I know at least 2 of them had to be shut down. Parts of them had to be shut down. The surrounding areas put on high alert. Talk a little bit about the effect of this and what people who are planning, people who are engineers, should take into account.
I think one of the things that the disaster in Fukushima a year and a half ago shows is that when nuclear power fails, it fails really dramatically and really terribly. And it tends to fail at the time when the rest of society is having problems too. So let's imagine, thank goodness this didn't happen, but let's imagine that one of the 26 nuclear power plants had a real problem. That would have distracted the governors and the mayors and FEMA and the president and everyone else who's making decisions, everyone else who's deploying resources. It would have distracted them from the people who are now in shelters or people who are now needing help in New York and New Jersey and the rest of the Eastern Seaboard. So I think we're really lucky. We avoided this, and I think the way to fix that is move away from nuclear power, because there's no safe place for nuclear power.
Absolutely. Well, Jacob Remus, assistant professor at SUNY Empire State College, enjoy the day off. I'm sure your students are not upset about it, but I do want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.